What have I got?
Crash Bandicoot: The Wrath of Cortex. What a weird game. It was released on October 29th, 2001 to mixed reviews due to its unoriginal and overall sporadic gameplay. Ever since I first played the game as a kid, there was always this aura of mystery the game had. It almost felt like I was playing snippets of what's supposed to be a bigger game. With so much beta footage and screenshots showing things that didn't appear in the game, it made me wonder what really went on behind the scenes. So, what is the mystery behind the development of Crash Bandicoot: The Wrath of Cortex? Before Wrath of Cortex even began development, a design document had to be made. Mark Cerny decided to pitch an open-world game called Crash Bandicoot Worlds.
Okay, the story. Neocortex has turned the peaceful solar system of Tib and Coda into his own laboratory experiment. Each of the 5 once beautiful and serene planets in the system has been converted into a virtual chemistry set. He has been employed by the ultimate evil, Elemental, her aim to create the perfect battle drone suitable to aid her conquest of the galaxy.
The game would be a free roamer, with 4 different hub worlds to explore, with each hub having 4 levels to play from the get-go, with the 5th level being unlocked after beating the prior 4. This 5th level would be one of Cortex's labs. A design document and a little demo level animation was made to pitch to Universal Interactive. From there on, the project got greenlit and development of the game's engine began. The game underwent development for a while at this point, even spawning a Japanese trailer showing off very early gameplay footage of what I originally thought was Crash Bandicoot Worlds, but, well, we'll talk about that later. This trailer would show off a slightly different model of Crash. It seems to be the same one they used in the final game, however, it looks like they edited it midway through development, changing the color of his ears and brows while having eyes that are slightly less exaggerated than they are in the final game. This trailer would show off 3 different levels: Crash and Burn, Ice Station Bandicoot, and an unknown cut level that we'll talk about later. Crash and Burn in particular has a cut segment at the beginning of the level that I'm assuming they cut because, well, the level was really long enough as is. I think they cut this section just to make it so the level doesn't overstay its welcome. Then we have Ice Station Bandicoot, which is almost completely different by the fact that you're actually traveling on foot, unlike in the final game where you race a polar bear around on a helipad. A few things to note in this trailer is that the camera seems to be free. I can't exactly tell if this is a free camera or a fixed camera. But judging by Ice Station Bandicoot, it seems like it was gonna be free roam? Maybe? I'll elaborate more on this later, because I do have a theory about this. You can also see a lot of small oddities, like Crash being able to break bounce crates for some reason, brown tinted TNTs, a completely different HUD, a really janky looking run animation, and Coco sitting in the cage, which was actually a remnant of the old story of what the game was going to be. This gameplay footage, as far as I'm aware, was the first gameplay footage publicly shown for Wrath of Cortex, before it was even known as Wrath of Cortex. Now, remember how I said that I originally thought that this footage was of Crash Bandicoot Worlds? Well, apparently I was wrong, because according to John Burton in an interview done by user iSwamp on Crash Mania, Crash Bandicoot Worlds actually never had anything made for it.
I run the team that worked on the game. There was no work done on Mark's version. Nothing exists. John Burton.
If that's the case, then what's going on with the camera in this early gameplay video? Well, while I don't have any concrete answers, I do have 2 theories. Theory 1, Ice Station Bandicoot and the other cut level were just meant to be tests that weren't meant to make it into the final game, but did for the sake of saving time, which explains why you're riding the helipad in the final version of Ice Station Bandicoot. Why build new scenery for an entirely new level when you already have one? Or, Theory 2, the camera is fixed, however it doesn't have a path to follow. This is actually evident in the final version of the game, because if you moon jump out of bounds, the camera will go off its path to follow the player, giving the illusion of a free camera when it really isn't. As the developers worked on the game, we got another early prototype video. Judging by the early HUD, this seems to predate the E3 build, however, I'm not sure by how much. In this first bit of gameplay, we get to see a very early version of Jungle Rumble. We see some assets that are missing, the river water is opaque instead of transparent, and there isn't a transition for when you get into the Jeep, and you're getting chased by a herd of multiple animals rather than just rhinoceros. In this clip, we see what I assume to be a very early rendition of Bonsai Bonsai. The reason why I assume that is because while it uses assets from that level, the layout is completely different. This clip actually shows off the level in its entirety, which is pretty neat. Next clip is of Crash and Burn, and we actually get to see the full section of the beginning that got cut. Remnants of this area still exist in the final game, and even exist in the E3 demo, which we will talk about in a second. It should also be noted that the level is very obviously unfinished, as evident by the lack of crates. On May 17th and 18th, E3 was going on at the Los Angeles Convention Center, with Wrath of Cortex not only being shown off, but actually had a booth set up for you to play it. Now before we talk about the E3 demo, we've got to talk about the E3 trailer, because judging by some of the oddities in this trailer, it was made way before E3. I say this because there are oddities here that not even the E3 build has. First of all, Crash's model has finally been edited to its final look. However, he still has that really janky run animation. I'm pretty sure they didn't change that until last minute because it appears a lot in these early trailers. But I digress. There are a lot of small things to note of, like the different HUD, the different exit portals, and Cortex having a tuxedo? Yeah. I'm not sure why they decided to change this, but for a while, Cortex was originally going to wear a tuxedo. You can actually see him wearing it in the windows of Wizards and Lizards, and on the box art for Crash Bandicoot The Huge Adventure, so this clearly must have made it really far in development. I actually really like this tuxedo design for Cortex. However, I can definitely see why they changed it. The classic Cortex design is very iconic. As much as Cortex does rock that tuxedo, it probably wouldn't have fit his character. But aside from that, there's a lot of stuff in this trailer that is just blatantly cut from the game, like this cut section from Arctic Antics, or this cut section from Crash and Burn, the fact that you can control the Jeep or mech in areas that you wouldn't in the final game. In fact, the mech itself was going to have a much bigger role in the game, as not only was it featured on the box and shown off in a lot of early gameplay videos, but you were actually going to fight the final boss with it, as the idea made it as far as to be referenced in the official strategy guide for the game. This strategy guide is actually going to get a section in itself because there's a lot of cool information in here. But the biggest thing that fascinates me about this trailer, the thing that fascinated me since I first watched this trailer as a kid, so much so that it has literally haunted my dreams, are these two clips. These two clips you see are very brief glimpses of what appears to be a completely different looking warp room. In the final game, each warp zone has a theme to it, with the first being Earth, the second being water, third being fire, fourth being snow, and fifth being space. However, in this trailer, each warp zone would be represented by the elemental associated with it on top of the pathway leading to it, and the hallways leading up to the warp zones were going to be much wider. This clearly was supposed to be a much bigger warp room, and sadly, that's all I have to say about it, as these two clips are the only glimpses of this warp room we have. Now, we can finally get to the E3 build. Now, for the longest time, this build was lost media, as many E3 builds of games are. These builds are specifically made to demonstrate their new game at a convention. For the longest time, we only had these clips to work with when it came to the E3 build. However, in 2021, a dedicated group of members from Hidden Palace started a project called Project Deluge, a project dedicated to finding and archiving early builds of video games. When Project Deluge first started, there were released dozens of early builds for games, with Wrath of Cortex just being one of them. I remember the night this happened and being incredibly excited about it, so much so that I legitimately thought I was either on drugs or dreaming, because never did I ever think that this build would ever get to see the light of day again. But it exists, and I cannot be thankful enough for the people who found it, but I digress. Let's take a look at this build. It should be a note that this build was made 4 months before the final release. Considering that the game only got 12 to 14 months of development, it kinda goes to show how much time they had to grind during those last 4 months of development. Let's start off with the most obvious difference, the loading screen. The loading screen was literally just a static image with text on the bottom telling you which assets were going to be loaded all Minecraft style. I'm 90% sure this was probably just a placeholder for the final loading screen. Then we get to see the title screen, which takes place in Coco's portal chamber lab thing, rather than in space like in Crash 2 and 3. I personally wish they kept this change. Like, I think the idea of having a title screen in space at this point in time was already overdone. It was done in Crash 2 and Crash 3. Maybe they did it for consistency considering the GBA games do this too, but I still like this lab setting. Judging by a prototype video uploaded by John Burton on GameHut, this title screen made it pretty far in development, and it was quite possibly a last minute change. Then we get sent to a very creepy looking warp room. Like, I'm not even joking, this has some crazy backrooms vibes. Like, you're in the warp room, but there's only one warp zone with Cortex's head on top of it. Then all surrounding, we have the elementals laughing at us. I don't know why they have them here. Maybe it was to show off the PS2's technology with how expressive they are? I have no idea. They're just here and it really creeps me out. Now, this rendition of the warp room is actually in the files of the final game. However, it's incredibly broken when you try to access it. However, if you look in the files of the E3 build, you'll actually find a blocked out version of the final warp room. Now, some of you may be thinking, Loaten, this is not the final warp room. This is the same warp room shown in the trailer. It has to be, right? Because it looks all blue. Well, I thought so too. But if you look closely at the clips and the warp room in the E3 build, you can tell straight away that these two are completely two different warp rooms. Not only by the skybox being different, but if you look closely at the corridors leading to each warp zone, they're much bigger than they are here. With how much smaller this particular warp room is, my theory is that this is just a blocked out version of what would become the final warp room. Why did they change the warp room so much? I have no idea. Now, when we hop into the levels, there are a lot of minor differences. So much so that it really wouldn't be worth talking about, as these levels are pretty similar to their final counterparts. Though that's not to say that these changes aren't interesting. Like, why in Bonsai Bonsai do they change the flamingos into cranes? It's a really odd change, but it exists. All these differences in this particular build are very strange, to say the least. Like, there are no bonus rounds or death routes in the platforming levels except for Crash and Burn, which is to be expected. But then you have really weird changes like the end level portal. It literally seems to be using the same portal that's used in the game's logo. Then you have different graphics for certain things, or missing graphics in general. Then you have Wizards and Lizards, or Enter the Dragon as it was originally called, having really weird oddities and uses the theme for medieval madness. After 12 to 14 months of development, Crash Bandicoot: The Wrath of Cortex finally released on October 9th, 2001, with the game receiving very mixed reviews. I already made a review of the game myself, and in my personal opinion, while it isn't terrible, it's very weak compared to the classic games. So what happened? Well, I tried doing some digging. I first started by reaching out to some of the developers and seeing if I could get their insight on what happened behind the scenes. Sadly, however, despite reaching out to many developers, I got little to no responses. The only person who got back to me was one of the game's soundtrack composers, Martin Jorstra. However, he didn't have much to say. Him and his partner make hundreds of songs every year, and they barely remember their involvement with the project, which is to be completely expected. Wrath of Cortex is a 20-plus-year-old game, and I would be lucky if I were to even get one of the developers to do an interview with me. However, there is another source I can look into, and that is the official strategy guide for the game. This strategy guide is very interesting as it has a lot of cool information. First of all, it straight up confirms that Tana did indeed leave Crash for Pinstripe. That wasn't just some silly little plot point from the manga, nah, that's canon. But I digress. The thing that's most interesting in my opinion are the developer interviews. We have an interview with Crash Bandicoot himself, which I'm sure was just a silly thing they did for fun. But then we have interviews with some of the developers. If I were to talk about all of these interviews, we'd be here longer than necessary, so I wanted to talk about the most interesting questions and answers. Originally, when you first heard you were going to be tackling Crash, what early ideas did you have?
We were originally going for a planet-hopping full 3D roaming adventure, as it was Crash's first outing on the PS2, and there was only a year or so of development time available. We eventually decided to use the tried and tested formula that makes Crash such an addicting game, John Bay. However, this idea was scrapped as we felt that Crash fans would want some classic Crash gameplay interspersed with fun new elements. Arthur Parsons.
What ideas and concepts didn't make it into the game that you would have liked to include?
We would have liked to have mini-bosses to combat in the levels themselves. However, after much thought, we decided that this would slow down the fast and frantic Clash gameplay. Arthur Parsons.
What ideas were seriously considered that you are glad were ditched?
Multiplayer. We wanted levels to be playable in a cooperative play, but we rightly decided against it. Arthur Parsons.
How long did it take to go from being given the green light to final code?
We had various game design changes early on, so I guess from when the format was settled, it was about 12 to 14 months of development. John Bay.
How long did you, Jeremy Pardon, personally work on the project?
I worked on the project for about 12 months. However, I was involved in concept development in the months prior to that, as we did demo work to ensure that we got the title. Jeremy Pardon.
When not working on Crash, what is the game of choice around the office?
We don't really have a lot of spare time on our hands, but Bridge Builder is probably the game most people have played during the project. James Conlife.
If you want to read these full interviews, you can pause the video here and read them for your own enjoyment. Reading these interviews, it kinda does give some insight on how things were done behind the scenes. Now to end this section off, I've gathered a slew of screenshots from beta builds that have been found over the years. Here is a compilation of those images. So, what happened? Why is Wrath of Cortex the way it is? Well, while I don't have a concrete answer, I do have a theory. It may not be the most interesting theory, but it's a theory I have come up with after doing all this research. And the sad fact of the matter is, Crash Bandicoot The Wrath of Cortex is a victim of being rushed. Unlike Crash Twinsanity, where the resulting game was due to poor management within the team, Wrath of Cortex was simply just rushed. The developers were only given 12 to 14 months to make an entire game, and as a game developer myself, I can tell you that it is not easy to make a full-fledged game in that amount of time, especially these days. But Naughty Dog also had 1 year to develop each of the games in the original trilogy, so how did Traveler's Tales fail at this feat? I think that question can be answered simply by saying it was a new generation. It was a new console generation, which means having to work with brand new engines. Then you have to refine that engine for your game, then make the concept for that game, then actually build the game. Imagine having to accomplish all of that with a brand new IP that you want to try to expand upon. It's clear that the developers tried mixing in the old with the new. That's why the first water level you start out as Swimming Crash, then transition to the submarine. But that's not the only theory I have. My second theory, which is probably less likely due to the lack of evidence, is that the game itself was very slapdashed at last minute. They had a multitude of Crash levels fully made with a completely different story and context in mind. However, due to overambition and overall time constraints, similar to Insanity, they had to pack those levels into one game, which explains why the game has so many different vehicle levels and why there were so much cut content shown in the trailers. But, as good old Matthew Patrick would say, that's just a theory. I'm not saying the thing. Screw you. So in conclusion, that is the beta of Crash Bandicoot: The Wrath of Cortex. It kind of is a damn shame that we didn't get to see all the content shown in the trailer be in the final game. I really do want to see that early rendition of the Warp Room shown in the E3 trailer in its entirety. Like I said, that is something that has legitimately haunted my dreams with its liminal space-esque feeling. I also really want to play those other cut renditions of levels shown in early gameplay videos, like the really old version of Banzai Banzai. Sadly, or I guess thankfully, the only pre-release build of the game we have is the E3 build, which like I said earlier, was a form of lost media for a long time. With that said, we can only hope that an earlier build will release someday. But for now, this is the beta of Crash Bandicoot: The Wrath of Cortex. I am the Loweton17. Thanks for watching.